that first period, show them we're there.
Keep this in your mind, make it happen.
As soon as Mariah lands, you get to go.
And go.
Coaches, staff members, volunteers, we want to help you win. We want your athletes to be free to compete at their absolute fullest. We want to remove distractions so you and your fellow coaches can focus on your important job at hand, preparing athletes for success. That's really what Safe Sport is all about, helping coaches create and promote safe training environments that allow every athlete the chance to succeed. Safe Sport's library of resources and training are all designed with athlete safety in mind. Don't make the mistake of thinking misconduct won't happen in your sport or organization. The problem is widespread. In fact, the rate of athlete abuse is striking. Before the age of 18, between 6 and 13% of competitive athletes experience some form of sexual abuse or assault within their sport. That's as many as 1 out of every 8 athletes. And the numbers may be even greater for elite athletes. The sports community, with our collective dedication, camaraderie, discipline, and energy, is the ideal position to better protect our athletes. And Safe Sport is built to help you recognize emotional, physical, and sexual misconduct. The training examines the coach-athlete relationship, defines the 6 primary forms of misconduct: bullying, harassment, and hazing, as well as emotional, physical, and sexual misconduct. It describes sexual abuse and identifies the signs and symptoms of sexual abuse, and discusses how to respond and report misconduct.
We're almost there. We're almost there.
In short, when the program is complete, you will have the tools to protect athletes and reduce misconduct. So, be aware. Study your surroundings. Get ready to act. Misconduct in sport is a problem that can be beat. At Safe Sport, we're here to provide you the resources to do it.
Stop. Beautiful. See? I saw that, and that was good.
One of the most harmful effects to any team dynamic is when athletes mistreat their teammates by bullying or harassing them, which, like all forms of misconduct, involves a misuse of power and is also destructive not only to the individual athlete, but to the morale and performance of the team as a whole. Safe Sport defines bullying in sport as a repeated pattern of committing or willfully tolerating physical and non-physical behaviors. These patterns are intended to cause fear, humiliation, or physical harm in an attempt to socially exclude, diminish, or isolate the targeted athletes. Bullying and harassment can be carried out verbally, socially, physically, and in cyberspace, one of the most recent disturbing trends. Social media and mobile communication allows 24/7 access to athletes. Teammates and fellow athletes are able to engage in misconduct that's even more difficult to observe directly. Bullies target every kind of athlete. For example, an athlete who's overweight, small, lacks confidence, and even the gifted athlete. Harassment is unwanted, offensive, and intrusive behaviors that are linked to discrimination, such as a bias against a particular group based on gender, race, ethnicity, religion, or sexual orientation. Harassment includes sexual harassment, which is pervasive. Sexual harassment is conduct that creates an inappropriate or hostile environment and includes behaviors such as repeatedly making sexual-oriented comments, jokes, or innuendos to or about an athlete. Bullying and harassment affect an athlete's performance. They lose focus or play and perform tentatively. A bullied athlete will rarely report because they fear retaliation or fear being viewed as a tattletale. Coaches set the stage for how athletes treat one another. Preventing bullying and harassment requires that we build environments conducive to team building. An adult is considered to be willfully tolerating these actions if he or she is aware of bullying and harassment and doesn't act to stop it. Adults who knowingly tolerate bullying and harassment of children might be at risk for criminal or civil actions depending on the laws of their particular state. Always talk with the athletes involved in a suspected pattern of bullying and harassment and stop it immediately. Also, because it can be difficult for an athlete who's being bullied and harassed to talk openly about his or her experience in the presence of the bullier, it's good practice to talk to each athlete involved separately to address the situation. You might learn about misconduct that's occurring in areas that you can observe, places such as locker rooms or cyberspace. Empower your athletes to do the same. Research shows that when peers step in, they're often successful in getting the bully to stop. Creating a culture of disclosure and reporting at the athlete's level will encourage them to come forward should there be any kind of misconduct or abuse. Part of what we love about sport is our opportunity to help athletes build a cohesive team. But when hazing, instead of treating others with respect and dignity, is used to form that bond, a truly cohesive team cannot exist. Hazing initiations include taping athletes up in locker rooms or requiring them to drink or take drugs. Often tolerated as a rite of passage, this type of sport can be damaging to an entire team. With 80% of college athletes reporting that they've witnessed or experienced some form of hazing, the problem is widespread. And it's easy to dismiss hazing as a harmless and traditional way of building team cohesion. Hazing is coercing, requiring, or willfully tolerating any humiliating, unwelcome, or dangerous activity for an athlete to join a team. Hazing does not include group activities that are meant to establish normal team behaviors that promote team cohesion. For instance, to set an example, consider having the entire team set up or carry equipment instead of singling out any one particular group. Hazing can include any combination of physical, social, and sexual abuse, and unlike bullying and harassment, hazing is an attempt to include an athlete on a team. So how can we respond to hazing and reduce its effects? Educate your staff, coaches, students, and parents about the dangers of it. Providing examples of consequences of hazing can help everyone understand its seriousness. Send a clear anti-hazing message, implement a strong anti-hazing policy, communicate it clearly, and enforce it when incidents occur. Consider consequences if those policies aren't followed, like team suspension. Next, we'll begin our discussion of emotional, physical, and sexual misconduct. A supportive coach-athlete relationship has a tremendous effect on the athletes and their competitive success. Coaches support their athletes by motivating them to accomplish more than they thought they could. And athletes thrive on this kind of positive support. A win-at-all-cost approach to coaching, or a failure to understand how to teach, motivate, or discipline athletes can lead to emotional misconduct. Safe Sport defines emotional misconduct as a sustained and repeated pattern of deliberate, non-contact behaviors. These non-contact behaviors include verbal acts, physical acts, and acts that deny attention and support. This definition is not intended as a substitute for the legal definition of emotional abuse, which is defined by state law. There are acceptable motivational, instructional, and disciplinary tactics used in sport. And to constitute emotional misconduct, the acts must be part of a sustained and repeated pattern, not an isolated outburst that occurs in the heat of the moment. Physical acts of emotional misconduct include physically aggressive behaviors, the enraged and screaming coach who throws sport equipment or punches a wall if an athlete performs poorly. But denying an athlete attention or support by ignoring or arbitrarily excluding them from practice or competition is the most threatening form of emotional misconduct. If a coach routinely ignores an athlete, the critical coach-athlete relationship breaks down, compromising the athlete's relationship with their coach, their team, and their sport. Emotional misconduct may also be a misguided attempt to motivate an athlete, punishment for a bad performance, or simply an inability to control frustration or anger. Prevention efforts can start with discussions on appropriate standards of behavior, athlete protection policies, and positive coaching techniques. If you've accidentally crossed the line with an athlete in the heat of the moment, consider apologizing. As we'll see in the next several lessons, emotional abuse is often linked with both physical and sexual abuse. Offenders often break down an athlete's resistance to abuse by manipulating them with unrealistic promises, praising them one day and degrading them the next, and simultaneously isolating them from their peers. Eventually, this abuse makes it easier for them to abuse an athlete. We'll take a look at physical misconduct next. Coaches support their athletes by motivating them to accomplish more than they thought they could, and by tailoring training programs that attend to their athletes' physical safety. Sport is physical, and with that comes the risk that an athlete will get hurt.
Safety is the environment that you work out in. It's the environment of the track. It's the environment of the implements. It's the environment of where people are positioned during certain times of the workout so that they do not put themselves in a place where they can become injured.
Physical misconduct is contact or non-contact behaviors that result in, have potential to, or threaten to cause physical harm to an athlete. We know you understand what prohibited physical contact is. It's fairly obvious. Don't choke, hit, or try to cause any intentional harm to your athlete. In other cases, what constitutes physical misconduct depends on the sport. In combat sports, punching, kicking, or striking an athlete is a well-regulated form of physical contact. This type of well-regulated physical contact is the sport. Of course, striking an athlete has nothing to do with figure skating or gymnastics. Non-contact forms of physical misconduct can be more difficult to recognize. Those offenses include denying adequate hydration, nutrition, or sleep, or overtraining an athlete. There is a fine line between pushing and motivating an athlete to do more than they thought they could and overtraining that athlete. Other examples of non-contact physical misconduct include encouraging or permitting an athlete to return to play after a concussion or other medical injury. Obviously, we don't want to ask an athlete who has torn a knee ligament to get back into the game with or without medical advice.
As a coach, these kids look up to us incredibly. They, trust every word we say, and they follow almost every word we say. And so if we don't stand up for the right things, we're sending them a very strong message that is negative.
Before we move to sexual misconduct, we recommend reading more information on nutrition, hydration, and proper training below. As we've discussed, an imbalance of power always exists between an athlete and coach. The coach has considerable control over athletes, and this power difference can lead to sexual harassment, sexual abuse, sexual assault, or other sexual intimacies that exploit the athlete. Sexual misconduct is any touching or non-touching sexual behavior with a person of any age that is non-consensual or forced, coerced or manipulated, or perpetrated in an aggressive, harassing, exploitative, or threatening manner. Sexual harassment is conduct that creates an inappropriate or hostile environment and includes behaviors such as repeatedly making sexual-oriented comments, jokes, or innuendos to or about an athlete. Sexual misconduct also includes sexual intimacies between an athlete and a coach, or another person in a position of authority. Several states recognize coaches as individuals who are in a position of trust and authority. As we've discussed, even when the sexual relationship is between adults, such relationships nonetheless involve an imbalance of power, with the coach continuing to control who makes the team, who gets playing time, and who gets to compete. Even if a sexual relationship between a coach and athlete is consensual and age-appropriate, the relationship inevitably affects team morale and raises questions about the misuse of power. Depending on the age of the athlete, these relationships might be legal in the eyes of the law, but still not acceptable because the imbalance of power often exploits the athlete. We're about to talk about sexual abuse at length, a form of sexual misconduct that is most difficult to discuss for many reasons we will explore. Throughout the remainder of the training, we'll discuss what it is, how it happens, what signs to look for, how to intervene, and how to report. It's hard to admit, but sport is a high-risk environment for child sexual abuse. It happens in every sport, at every age, and at every competitive level. Definitions of sexual abuse vary by state. Here, Safe Sport defines sexual abuse as any sexual activity with a minor where consent is not or cannot be given. However, you should always consult relevant law to determine your legal obligations. As used here, a minor is anyone who is under the age of 18. Sexual activity between an adult and a minor is always abuse and is never the victim's fault. Sexual contact between minors may also be sexual abuse. Rules about sexual conduct between minors are also governed by state law, but generally, abuse occurs when there is an aggressor, an age disparity, or an imbalance of power and/or intellectual capabilities. Like all forms of sexual misconduct, sexual abuse includes both touching and non-touching offenses. Non-touching abuse includes discussing sex, showing the athlete pornographic materials, and sending sexually explicit text, emails, or photos. Children know their abusers more than 90% of the time, and we, along with professionals who deal with predators on a daily basis, cannot spot a predator by just looking at him or her. Nor are males the only abusers. Approximately 1/3 of all child sexual abuse occurs at the hands of females. Criminal background checks and sexual offender registries only identify people who have a criminal record. And less than 10% of sexual predators have been caught or prosecuted. How can an offender go undetected for so long? Offenders are adept at deception, and like many successful professionals, offenders in sport are highly qualified, intelligent, and patient, with good interpersonal skills and a positive self-image. Although there is no checklist that we can use to identify an offender, there are red flags that help us recognize these behaviors. For example, offenders groom or prepare their victims for predatory actions with attention, affection, and gifts. These are red flags that require attention, but do not mean that the person is necessarily abusive. Once we recognize these grooming behaviors, which we will learn in the next lesson, we can intervene and report to protect the athlete. Predators maintain control through a combination of attention, affection, and gifts, part of the grooming process. Here we'll take a look at the 6 stages of grooming to help us recognize a predator. Targeting a victim, gaining trust, recognizing and fulfilling needs, isolating the child, sexualizing the relationship, and maintaining control.
The first step in the process is selecting a victim or targeting a victim. There are a lot of different things that offenders look for. For example, they're looking for a vulnerability in that child.
While certain children may be more vulnerable than others, the fact is that any athlete may be preyed upon by a kind and affectionate adult.
The next stage in the process is the predator gaining the trust of the athlete. One of the key things that predators need in order to accomplish their crime is the trust of the victim. The coach is oftentimes perceived as a hero, as a mentor, as a figure to be looked up to by children, and so the trust comes automatically not only to the victim, but to those around the victim. The next step in the process is the coach recognizing what the needs of the child are and then fulfilling those needs in order to accomplish the abuse. Some of those needs could be attention, positive reinforcement, a starting position, a scholarship, or an introduction to recruiters.
The predator is now getting to know the athlete, developing a special relationship with them, and learning what the athlete values. To exert greater power over the athlete, they begin giving gifts, extra attention and affection, and the predator begins trying to control the athlete even off the field.
The next step in the process is isolating the child. When somebody is being engaged, they might be told that there's a special relationship that we have, they might share secrets, they might be told that the offender is the only one who really understands them. The next step in the process is the sexualizing of the relationship. This is, of course, accomplished after the breaking down of psychological and physical barriers. One of those ways can involve what I would call accidental nudity. The locker room is a perfect place for this to happen. The offender will set up a situation where the victim accidentally sees the offender naked, for example, and this can lead to a discussion of sex or nudity or body parts. Another way to groom a child would be to use pornography or to touch a child and get that child desensitized to touch, confusing the child about the nature of the touch. The final step is maintaining control over the relationship. This is also called the secrecy or concealment phase. Basically, the better the coach is at picking a victim and breaking down the psychological and physical barriers, the less overt the coach has to be in keeping the secret. It's inherent in the relationship.
As Prosecutor Mitchell has made clear, the grooming process has distinctive and identifiable behavior: targeting a victim, gaining trust, recognizing and filling needs, isolating the child, sexualizing the relationship, and maintaining control. With these techniques in mind, we can identify red flags and disrupt a predator at the beginning stages of the grooming process. For example, does this person buy expensive gifts for or give an athlete money for no reason? Does this person try to separate the athlete from their teammates or parents? Does this person try to find ways to be alone with the athlete? Click below for a fuller list of possible red flags. Predators take considerable time grooming athletes, parents, and fellow coaches to gain their trust. We will look at strategies that reduce a predator's opportunity to abuse. The most common opportunities are locker rooms, bathrooms, or other unmonitored areas on site, unsupervised out-of-program contact, usually at an off-site residence, social events involving alcohol, local travel to and from practice or competition, and overnight travel. Training and competition sites provide predators with ample opportunity to abuse athletes. Predators frequently target athletes in private spaces such as locker rooms, bathroom facilities, and other unmonitored spaces such as a personal office. Athletes are also more vulnerable to abuse when they're changing clothes, showering, or unclothed. If they're undressed, they often won't run away to avoid abuse. The risk of abuse increases if the athlete is alone with an adult. Also keep in mind that if your athlete group includes a wide range of ages and developmental stages, the opportunity for athlete-to-athlete abuse increases. One suggestion to minimize these opportunities is conduct regular sweeps of the locker room to make sure a child isn't alone with an adult or an older athlete. Finally, if a coach or another adult needs to have a meeting with an athlete, consider leaving the door to the office open, or holding the meeting in a room with windows, or having another person attend the meeting. Another common way to isolate athletes is through unsupervised out-of-program contact. Predators often use sport to meet children. One way to reduce these risks is by adopting and monitoring compliance with a policy that limits out-of-program contact. Describe what activities the club provides and supervises. Any other activities may be a red flag and should be scrutinized. We have now talked about emotional, physical, and sexual abuse. In this session, we'll talk about the signs and symptoms of abuse. Specifically, we will discuss why athletes rarely say anything if they're being abused, describe the behavioral, physical, and emotional changes in an athlete that may indicate abuse, and provide guidance on how to respond if an athlete is signaling that there's a problem. Eyewitness evidence of abuse is rare. As we've discussed, most sexual predators are skillful at concealing their actions. So, to protect athletes, we need to recognize how athletes react when they're being abused. Because this issue is so tough, athletes rarely disclose what's happening to them. Children have a limited understanding of sexuality and sexual abuse. They may not realize for years that what they experience was even abuse. Abused athletes often fear the social stigma associated with being classified a victim. An athlete may also worry about what will happen if they are believed. They think the abuse is their fault. They worry about whether they will still be able to compete. Most signs of sexual abuse are behavioral, so the key is to be aware of any sudden behavioral changes.
Some of the things to observe in a youth athlete that, again, are red flags: they totally lose enthusiasm for their sport. They no longer want to go to practices or do all the extra workouts they used to do. Sometimes it'll be a self-defeating behavior, like they just stop trying and they figure if they don't try, they'll get tossed off the team. They won't be as good, so they won't get chosen to be on the travel squad or the varsity squad. You couple it with some of those behaviors and someone who's now acting depressed, reserved, withdrawn. They don't interact with people the way they used to.
By learning to recognize the signs and symptoms of abuse and asking questions, we can offer athletes support and a chance to tell us what's going on. Begin by telling the athlete what you see: unexplained outbursts, a decline in performance, or skipping out on practice without explanation. Ask the athlete if anything is wrong. Specifically ask if anything is going wrong around the clubhouse or with practice or competition. Tell them that you would like to help with whatever the problem is. You may not get a direct answer when you first ask the question. If the athlete tells you nothing's wrong, continue to observe the athlete and raise your concerns again if necessary. If the athlete does report abuse, listen carefully and calmly. Let the athlete know that they have the right to refuse sexual advances and help them understand that the physical and emotional abuse is not okay. Also, make sure the athlete understands it is not his or her fault. If a child or minor discloses abuse, then you'll need to report it to the proper law enforcement authorities. Now, let's address one of the most critical pieces of this training. How do we respond to misconduct or policy violations, including allegations of child sexual abuse? Regardless of the policy violation or the type of misconduct, there are 4 basic steps for responding. First, interrupt or disrupt the conduct. Second, share your concerns. Third, report to your designated administrator. And fourth, if you suspect child abuse, report to the proper law enforcement authorities. The most important step in protecting your athletes is to report any suspicion or allegation of abuse to the proper law enforcement authorities. Legal reporting responsibilities vary by state, but we'll walk through the basics of whom, when, and how to report. These recommendations are based on guidelines from the Department of Health and Human Services Child Welfare Information Gateway. Links to reporting laws will also be provided at the end of this lesson. Let's start by looking at who needs to report. Most states designate professionals who are required to report child abuse. They are known as mandatory reporters, and these individuals usually have frequent contact with children. Several states include coaches as mandatory reporters. While some states identify individuals who must report, in many states, any person who suspects child abuse must report. Failing to report abuse may result in criminal charges. Even if not a mandatory reporter, we can all voluntarily report suspected abuse to the proper law enforcement authorities. We all have an important role in our athletes' development and encourage everyone to report suspected abuse to the proper law enforcement authorities. So when should we report? This will also vary by state, but the Department of Health and Human Services states that there are 2 basic standards that are used for both mandatory and permissive reporters. We need to report when 1, we suspect or have reason to believe that a child has been abused or neglected, or 2, we have knowledge of or observe a child being subjected to conditions that would reasonably result in harm to the child. If you receive an allegation of abuse or suspect abuse, do not attempt to evaluate the credibility or validity of the allegation as a condition for reporting to appropriate law enforcement authorities. Most states have toll-free numbers for reporting abuse, and typically, reports may be made anonymously, though it's useful to know the reporter's identity. Most states keep their abuse and neglect records confidential, and most states specifically protect the identity of the reporter from disclosure to the alleged perpetrator, even if other information from the report is disclosed. Always consult your state laws and work with an attorney if you have questions. Regardless of your legal obligations, your club may require you to report suspicions or allegations of abuse or misconduct. Check with your club and ask what you need to report, how you can report, and to whom you should report concerns. Your responsibilities under your club's reporting policy may be broader than your legal obligations.
Kids may be really young, but they're really smart, and it's really, really important for them to know that our number one priority is to keep them safe and to help them accomplish their goals.
In conclusion, it is everyone's responsibility to protect our athletes by disrupting, sharing, and reporting any suspicions or allegations of misconduct or abuse. Any suspicions or allegations of child abuse should be reported to your club and the proper law enforcement authorities. It is not your responsibility to investigate allegations of abuse. Know your state's reporting laws and what constitutes abuse in your state. You may be subject to legal and/or civil liability if you don't report. Understanding how to recognize misconduct and properly report it is essential to maintaining the safe and fun environment that sport creates for athletes and coaches of all ages.